Welcome to Bookstorm. We're super excited to have Stephen James with us today. We're going to be talking about his new book, Synapse. Give you a little info on Stephen. He is a national best-selling novelist whose award-winning, pulse-pounding thrillers continue to gain wide acclaim. Suspense Magazine named Stephen's book, Every Wicked Man, one of the best books of 2018. They say that he sets new standards in suspense writing. Publishers Weekly calls him a master storyteller at the peak of his game. RT Book Reviews promises the nail-biting suspense will rivet you. He earned International Book Awards, Christie Awards, International Thriller, INSPI, Suspense Zone Reviewer's Choice Award, and if I don't stop here, we're never going to get to the podcast. Stephen weaves intense stories of psychological suspense with deep philosophical insights. Equipped with a unique master's degree in storytelling, he's taught writing and storytelling on 4 continents over the past 2 decades and has spoken to more than 2,000 times at events across the globe. In fact, Kristen and I have had the pleasure of taking some of Stephen's amazing writing classes and thoroughly enjoyed him. His short fiction has appeared in more than 80 different publications, including the Writer's Digest and the New York Times. His podcast, The Story Blender, interviews leading storytellers in film, print, and web. And when Stephen isn't writing or speaking or teaching or podcasting, you'll find him trail running, playing basketball, or drinking dark roast coffee in the Appalachian Highlands of Tennessee. And Stephen, thank you so much for joining Kristen and I here today.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for the kind introduction.
And we're here to talk about your latest book, Synapse. It's a near future thriller. It was a finalist at the International Book Awards in Science Fiction. And the author, James Hannibal, calls this book putting yourself in the front row car of a runaway roller coaster. It's a thriller you can't afford to miss.
Now, Stephen, I don't want to give away any spoilers, and I won't for our listening audience, but I thought I would tell them very briefly a little bit about the book Synapse.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, it takes place 30 years in the future. Artificial intelligence has advanced to the point where robots, or artificials, as you call them, look like people, and especially some of the newer models that are coming online, some of them seem to be almost indistinguishable in some respects. But they are cognizant of feelings, of emotions, and in fact, they have some rights, which I thought was absolutely fascinating as an attorney. I'm fascinated by that aspect. But they live side by side with humans, assisting them in various things, sometimes even in emotional support. The story focuses on Kestrel Hathaway, and she's a woman who also happens to be a pastor. She has just experienced a very serious tragedy in her life, and then she witnesses a terrorist attack. To help her get through this time, she is gifted an artificial named Jordan, and Kestrel and Jordan become embroiled in a world of conspiracies and lies where pretty soon you're not even sure what to believe. It is heart-pounding is a very good word, Chris, that you used. But with a second attack on the horizon, the two of them team up with a federal counterterrorism agent to try to thwart this attack. What is fascinating is that as the pressure mounts, Jordan is asking questions that artificials were never meant to ask. And some of those questions about, what happens at the end of me? What happens when I am no longer functioning as an artificial? But it's a book about the future, but also about our right now. And I think like Kestrel and Jordan, we're asking some of these same questions. So, with that backdrop, Stephen, Chris, are you ready to brave the storm?
We sure are. And we could talk about this book for hours and hours. There are so many beautiful layers to this story. But as you know, we don't have time, so we're going to focus in on a couple different questions for Stephen. In Synapse, the heroine Kestrel struggles with the death of her infant daughter. She says that heartache is her way of expressing continued love for her daughter. She couldn't imagine living without the pain. That time doesn't heal, but as it passes by, it causes more things to vie for our attention. But it doesn't mean we're healed. It got me thinking, Stephen, do we grieve for our lost loved ones, or are we really grieving for ourselves? And do we think that we're really
Yeah.
honoring them by this continued grief? And I was just wondering, what was the journey through grief that you may have been trying to show us through this beautiful character, Kestrel's life? And how do you think she stayed as strong as she did until the very end?
Hmm. Those are great questions. One time I was, many years ago, I was watching a television show or something, and it was actually when I think I do remember when this was. Okay, so it was when the space shuttle exploded.
Mm-hmm.
And we lost some astronauts. I can't remember how many. I think it was 8, but whatever the number was, I remember we nationally kind of mourned for these people. I mean, I didn't know them personally, but of course I felt sad and grief over the fact that we'd lost them in this event. But I wondered, how long should I feel that way? Like a week, a month, for people that I'd never met? And what about people that I do know that I've lost over the years? What is the role of grief, and how does it intersect with time? And at what point do we say, okay, I'm over that, or I've moved on? Those are interesting questions for me. And for me personally, it's not like I approach a book with answers. I actually approach it with questions, kind of like what you pinpointed there a moment ago. So that I believe that drama is developed through tension. And so if I start a book knowing all the answers, then I've undermined the very tension, the drama of the story. And so I usually try to come up with some interesting questions and say, I don't know what I exactly think about that. I'm going to actually explore it. So I think in her case, the loss is so intimate, Kestrel's case, that she has this, I don't know that anything can ever really fill the gap of the loss of a child, like in that case. But I think she needs to find the resources to collect herself and take the next step. And she hasn't done that when the story begins.
Yeah, I think it was beautiful how you wove her character and how we saw her even grow or find strength in different areas. I have a friend here who lost a very close loved one recently, and she said to me, I hate it when people tell me to move on. I don't think I'm ever going to move on, but I may move forward. I may be able to move forward. And I sometimes think if we don't get rid of the grief, but maybe we learn to coexist with it in some way. But I just thought this character was beautiful, and it opened a lot of questions for the reader because we can all relate to this grief. Thank you for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. Stephen, both Kestrel and Jordan wrestled with the idea of rights for non-humans. And this is a hot button topic. I teach a course at the law school, and we're talking about biodiversity and wildlife and whether or not animals should be accorded rights. In fact, we have locally here, we are in the Great Lakes, and we have a town in Ohio, Toledo, and they voted to accord rights to Lake Erie. And the idea, of course, is that in and of themselves, these things, these animals, the lakes, rivers, or trees, have value. It's not just a matter of what value they provide for humans. It's they are independently and inherently have value. And I wanted to kind of explore that a little bit with you, because it seems like some of what you were exploring are what are some of the essential qualities of being a human, and what are some of the things that we should be evaluating in terms of whether or not rights should be appropriately granted in a situation?
When I first actually started writing this book, I've always loved science fiction. Okay, because it allows you to ask big questions, interesting questions about human nature, and what the questions that you've just brought up a moment ago. And I had met with, or I'd come to so many books that deal with artificial intelligence. So my question was, what about artificial belief? Like, not what does a machine know, but when a machine has free will, consciousness, and so on, what will it choose to believe and what are the implications of that? And so if you have an entity, say an AI, who has free will and is self-aware and has consciousness, um, are they alive? How do you define what is alive? And at what point do you start to grant them certain rights? These were intriguing questions for me. Um, what is it that we should attribute a right to? Is it something that has intelligence, moral capability, or the ability to make moral decisions? Like in this story, he has the ability to make moral decisions. He can choose to do certain things. And, the question is, like, in the jungle today, is there morality before humans enter it? That's kind of what was on my mind. In other words, do animals have a sense of morality or right or wrong? And I don't necessarily think that they do. Now, there's people that disagree with me. There are evolutionists that look at primate behavior and say, well, humans act in certain ways, and so we would expect to find that in other primates and so on. And there are certain things that we find and certain things that we don't find. But I personally believe that humans are really the only animals that don't act in congruity with who they are. In other words, I think Chesterton was the one who said that don't accuse humans of being inhumane or acting like animals because it's an insult to animals. So we are the only ones that really will torture each other. Some monkeys and so on will attack and kill and maybe murder, we might say, but humans are the only ones who seem to take pleasure in inflicting pain on their own kind. So in that sense, we've both risen above and fallen below other animals in a sense. Like, we know right from wrong, yet we continue to do what we know isn't right. And so all of these fueled the genesis for this idea of, if you have a machine and he actually is living with regret, remorse, let's say, how will he deal with that? When you're mentioning animal rights and so on, I just saw this last week that there was a goldfish that they have in like a goldfish tank. Okay, so, and there are motion sensors so that when the goldfish pokes its nose against this wall over here, it actually moves the tank closer in a certain direction. So that the goldfish can actually direct where this vehicle goes. So it's a goldfish driven vehicle. And if it gets to this one wall, it will get a reward, like it'll get fed certain food. And they found that goldfish can maneuver this vehicle around and get to this wall in order to get food. So they actually have a certain level of foresight, of understanding action and reaction. Goldfish, right? So how many rights should we give to a goldfish who's, in a sense, aware of what he wants and how to achieve it? Pretty crazy stuff, interesting stuff. So I don't have the answers as far as, all of these questions, but I do know that I think in South America, maybe it was Brazil, there was an ape, I think, that was granted, or maybe it was Italy. Maybe you know more than I do, but anyway, an ape was granted certain human rights or something like that. And so I think they're great questions to ask. And I think as AI develops, we're going to have to start to address some of these questions, which will be fun and give rise to even more stories, I'm sure.
Yeah, and actually in New York State, our Court of Appeals had to wrestle with this issue because there was a case filed on behalf of Happy the elephant, as well as other primates. And the idea was to allow them to be free in more of a natural habitat and not be caged. The lower court actually agreed that there should be some degree of rights afforded these animals, but the Court of Appeals reversed and said we're not there
Oh,
yet.
wow. Huh.
And it is
Interesting.
a fascinating discussion, right? Because we've got animals that we know have higher order thinking,
Have,
like porpoises and dolphins and
yeah.
and elephants. And so very, very interesting discussion.
Super. And we were talking about this for about an hour before you even came on today. It just goes so deep. The other issue that I wanted to bring up is this whole notion about the robot versus the human, what you were just talking about, and also human versus human. We can give each other rules, we can program, we can set laws with the robot, or with each other, we could demand etiquette, rules, laws. But there's one thing that we can't force or demand. And if we do, it doesn't count. We can't make somebody love us. We can't force somebody to care. You can't force empathy. If I say to my husband on our anniversary, it's our anniversary, I want you to come here with a dozen roses, and I want you to say, I love you more than the day that I met you. And he could do it, but guess what? Doesn't count.
It doesn't count.
No, it doesn't
Poor
count.
guy. What?
It's got to come from inside us. So even in your story, when the robot was programmed to do all the right things, there are times where the law doesn't matter anymore. It has to be an inherent thought or action inside of you that sort of says who you are. There are times where the law doesn't apply. And I wondered if this was something that you had intended to work in, or is this something that just sort of flowed out of the story?
When I first started the story, like I write very organically. You both may know that because you've been in my classes. I don't outline or plot anything out when I begin a story. And so I began with these questions of, what if a robot, or Jordan in this case, has free will, consciousness, and so on? Well, what if, can he choose to love? And what would that actually mean to him? And so there is a scene in the story where he makes a choice and later regrets that, because he did love this individual, not in a romantic way. It wasn't like a Westworld sort of a thing, but that he did have compassion and love and so on for this individual. And later he wants forgiveness for not doing what he could to rescue this person. And so, of course, Kestrel says, you don't need forgiveness. You're a machine. And he says, but I'm a morally free agent. Like, I can make choices, and I did. And I want to find forgiveness for this. And so in a sense, it's his quest, not just to find identity, but to find forgiveness. Well, does a machine need forgiveness? Does a dog need forgiveness? Do animals need forgiveness? So again, just for me, if I can get people asking questions about things that matter, I think, hey, that's all that I could ever ask from a story. I mean, of course, I want the stories to be entertaining, but if they can also bring up some of these issues, I think that's, to me, the greatest compliment to an author, is that people would not only enjoy, but start asking some of the questions that you all have asked. And so what is love? Is it just simply a choice? Is it attraction? Is it commitment? Is it respect? Is it all of those? What if you take one away? Do you still have love? These are intriguing questions to me.
Mm-hmm. To all of us. This book brings out so many little pearls and little ideas to contemplate and think about, and even put into your own life, merge it into your own life. Really, lots of wisdom in this book. Thank you.
Yeah, and kind of a final question. You have mentioned how Jordan had a conscience and a free will, and even a desire to maybe worship a god. And, I was wondering, is this a soul? I mean, I knew you were hinting around that issue. I always, for example, think about, my dogs show great remorse. Like, they will counter surf, because they're very big. They will counter surf and eat an entire loaf of bread. And when I catch them in the act, they look very remorseful. So it really, Chris and I were really wrestling with this idea of what are things that set us apart as humans? Is it the existence of a soul? And do animals have a soul? And obviously, none of us have answers, but I was wondering if that was some of the topics that you were really wrestling with through this book and how that impacted you.
There's actually in the Bible, in Ecclesiastes, there's a verse, and I can't off the top of my head tell you which one it is, but it says, um, who's to say that the spirits of men go up and the spirits of the animals go down? Okay, so it's fascinating that the author of this verse basically seems to make the assumption that animals have some sort of spiritual essence to them, or some soul or something like that. So people could debate that, or have different interpretations, but I find that fascinating. So do I really believe that a dog has a soul? I don't know that I do or don't, but I think it's really fascinating to ask and to think about. Now, as far as, Jordan, in this sense, what would a soul look like in an artificial or an AI? So for instance, sometimes we just think like that if we eventually had machines that were self-aware and so on, that they would be atheists or something along those lines, which seems silly to me because so many people who are well educated and have looked at the evidence have come to the conclusion, look, there's enough evidence that I believe in God. And I believe that, robots will eventually do that as well. So some robots would probably be atheists. Some would probably believe in God. So if you have a robot who does believe in God and actually is free to make moral choices, and actually desires to maybe worship or connect or pray to God, who's to say that they don't have a soul? I don't know. All we're doing is asking deeper and deeper questions, but it's fascinating, I think.
Well, that's one of the things we loved about the book is not only is it entertaining, but at every turn you are thinking about these issues, about what does it mean to have a soul and what sets us apart, and would AI be thinking about these things 30 years down the road? Those are excellent questions, but again,
Yeah.
never lose the sense of the thrill in your fiction, which is what I think is so cool.
Well, that's good. I am a suspense writer at heart. And so even though when I started writing this, I had some sort of philosophical questions to ask, I was like, I don't want it to just become an, introspection. It's still about a terrorist attack, of course, because that's just where my mind actually takes me when I write.
There was excitement around every turn, and I know from taking your writing classes that you don't have the plot formulated ahead of time, but I remember you saying, always have action, something happening, something suspicious, something exciting. And I look for that in your writing, and it really pulls you into that story so deep and wants you to keep going. Just wonderful. Stephen, what's on your radar now? What are you working on? Can you give us any clues or of what's coming up next?
I have a new series that I finished the first book of, and it will release early next year, I believe, or late this year. And so I'm working on the second one there. I also have a book on storytelling that comes out this August from HarperCollins Leadership, which is for mainly business leaders and others who want to begin to tell stories more effectively wherever they are. Teachers, educators, business leaders, and so on. It's called The Art of Detail. So that will come out in August. So over the last couple of years of this pandemic, it's been crazy, but I've been hard at work putting some new projects together. Yeah.
Sounds very exciting. So for
Yeah.
our listeners, you can connect with Stephen on his website at stephenjames.net, Facebook, Twitter, or you can tune into his podcast, Story Blunder, at storyblender.com. You could even take one of his critically acclaimed writing classes like Kristen and I have, or better yet, how about pick up this new book, Synapse? You can buy Synapse wherever books are sold. Thank you, Stephen.
Thanks so much for the chance to be here. I appreciate it.
Happy New Year. Happy New Year.
Yeah, you too.